I have to tell you, I am lost for words. Oh, I've been looking forward to seeing Paestum for a very long time, so please forgive me for being a little bit excited. Goodness, here in the light of the Paestum sun, these temples are just glorious. The temple on the right is probably, we don't know for sure, dedicated to Hera, queen of the gods, and this one very likely to Poseidon, after whom the colony was named, Poseidonia. Poseidonia was founded around the end of the 7th century BC, and the name Paestum came over 200 years later, so called by the local Italic people who were becoming more prominent in the colony. The first colonists were Dorians, in other words, broadly speaking, from the western side of Greece, and this is reflected in the construction of their temples. The capitals at the tops of the columns have the Doric simplicity and less of the elaborate, more floral style of Ionic or Corinthian columns, but handsome all the same. The Greek colonies did all the things you'd expect of a Greek community. They enjoyed festivals, they engaged in philosophical and scientific speculation, they built some magnificent buildings, and they created wonderful art. Some colonies were governed by democracies. Well, from time to time, that is. They came and went in a seesaw of political infighting between those trying to take power as autocrats and others pursuing the democratic path. An autocrat in the Greek world had the name tyrannos, tyrant, which doesn't carry quite the same pejorative meaning as it does today. We're here at the Ecclesiasteron, which is the assembly place, where the Greeks would come and do what they did best, discuss and argue. And I don't mean the set twos that we all have with our nearest and dearest from time to time, but that passion for debate which infuses their lives, their politics, their philosophy, their dramas, their histories, all their literature, from the very first epic poems of Homer and their set-piece speeches, all of which the Romans would seek to emulate and absorb into their own culture. Rhetoric would become the priority subject for parents aspiring to and being able to afford an education for their children. Well, for their sons at least. Roman appetite for Greek literature took off in the second half of the 3rd century BC, once they'd got the better of the Carthaginians in the First Punic War, and they had access to the seas and could sail across to Egypt, and in particular to Alexandria, where was housed the great library of the Greek world. In the same period we start to see writings in Latin appear, most of it modelled on Greek works. But what is becoming clearer and clearer, and perhaps less obvious on our radar, is that Roman and Italian absorption of Greek culture had been going on for many years before that. Greek stories had passed into Roman folklore long before they were first written down in Latin. Now, you can tell that from the Greek art that's been discovered all over Italy. And Plautus, when he came to write his broadly appealing comedies towards the end of the 3rd century BC, I think it's pretty clear that his audiences were already familiar with the Greek plots. Behind me in that last clip is a third temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. Archaeologists have now found yet another, much smaller one, further from the city, which we weren't able to see. But imagine the early Romans in 500 BC travelling less than 200 miles down the coast to this assembly of magnificent buildings. They must have been even more impressed than we are. Not a great many pieces of pottery have been found from the time of Poseidonia. Here are 2 Attic lekythoi, which would have contained oil, or perhaps perfumed oil. Paestum is a wonderfully fragrant area, a delightful mix of lemon and olive trees, jasmine, lavender, and roses. They even got a mention in Virgil's Georgics. Atque equite extremo niam sub fine laborum vela trahant terris festina ad vertere proram forsitan et pinguis hortos quae ura collendi ornaret canerem differique rosaria Paesti. Not so very much Greek art survives from the time of Posidonia, but the tombs of the Lucanians show some very colourful work. The Lucanians were the Italic people who populated Paestum from the 4th century onwards, and in the 3rd century BC, Paestum would come under the control of the Romans, and they did what they do: build an amphitheatre. Te morituri, salutamus. And so we leave Paestum with one last lingering gaze and set off not too far down the coast to the colony of Elea. So we've come to the Greek colony Elea, or Thalia as it's now known, or indeed the first Greek colonists called it Wele. The first settlers came from Phocia in Asia Minor, in Ionia on the coast there, and they were fleeing the increasingly intimidating neighbours, the Persians. They came here in about the middle of the 6th century BC. One of the first citizens was the philosopher Parmenides, and he was a pre-Socratic philosopher. In other words, he was a philosopher before Socrates, so that's the first half of the 5th century BC and earlier. In fact, according to Plato, Parmenides met Socrates, or we'll put that the other way around because Socrates was a youngster. Socrates met Parmenides. Now, Parmenides engaged in cosmological speculation about the phenomena all around us, seeking a scientific explanation for things which were by other people attributed to the various myths and fables. He also engaged in questions about what is actually real, as opposed to what only seems to be real. Questions which are as relevant in our world as they were in his. Much of the site excavated here at Elea is probably Roman, although the remains of these houses are likely to be from the earlier Greek settlement. There is a relatively small theatre above the colony on their Acropolis, and from that point a splendid view of the sea and who might be coming or going. And now we make the journey to the Cape of Palinurus. The small roads winding around mountainous ravines suddenly got even more mountainous and even more ravenous, can I invent that word, when our programmed route was barred by reports of falling rocks. Eventually, unscathed, we came down to the sea and Palinuro. Another cape, another mishap suffered by a comrade of Aeneas at sea. Before it was Maecenas, who foolishly challenged the god to a musical contest. This time it's poor Palinurus, who somewhat harshly is sent to sleep by the gods while he's manning the rudder. Aeneas sees the unmanned rudder. He doesn't know what's happened, and sadly chides his missing comrade.
Oh, nimium Pilo et pelago confisa sereno. Nuda sin ignota Palinure, Jacobis arena.
And that was read for us by James Mountford. Now, Aeneas is not aware of the divine intervention, and later, when he goes down to the underworld with the Sibyl, he comes across the soul of Palinurus milling around with the other souls, still waiting for a passage across the Styx. He can't get across the Styx because his body hasn't yet been buried. In fact, he didn't die at sea. He managed to get to the shore, but sadly for him, the local inhabitants killed him when he got there. Now, the soul of Palinurus begs Aeneas and the Sibyl to take him with them across the Styx. But the Sibyl says no.
Und haec, o Palinure, tibitem dira cupido. Tu stugias in humatus aquas amnemque severum eumenido spicies, ripamui injustis adibis, destine fata deum flecti sperare precando.
The words of the Sibyl read for us by Linda Martinez. The Sibyl then softens a little and consoles Palinurus, telling him that people all around will come together and build him a tomb, make the appropriate offerings and release his soul to cross the Styx.
Sed capi dictamemur, duris solacia casus, nam tua finitimi longe lateque per urbes prodigiis acti calestibus ossapiabunt, et statuent tumulo solemnia mittent, altenumque locus Palinure nomen habebit.
His dictis curae motae pulsusque parum per corde dolor tristi gaudet cognomine terra. Well, we couldn't find the tomb to Palinurus, but nonetheless we've enjoyed looking for it.